One autumn night in 1983, a small-town pastor and his 5-year-old daughter vanished without a trace. For nearly 3 decades it was labeled a disappearance. Some called it an accident, others a quiet escape. The police closed the case. The church moved on. But his wife never did. Then, one crisp October morning, the phone rang. The rain had stopped just an hour before the evening service began at St. John's Chapel, and the late October air in Marlow, Oregon, carried a damp chill. Pastor Elias Harper pulled his dark wool coat tighter as he parked his aging beige Ford LTC in the gravel lot behind the chapel. It was a small-town kind of Sunday, quiet, familiar, unremarkable. But beneath that gentle surface, something waited to snap. Leah Harper, his 10-year-old daughter, bounded out from the passenger seat, her auburn hair still damp from the bath she'd taken that afternoon. She clutched her father's Bible in one hand and a small plastic rabbit keychain in the other, a trinket she'd insisted on bringing. "Can I light the candles tonight? Can I light the candles tonight? Only if you promise not to race the deacons down the aisle again," he said with a wink. Leah giggled and skipped ahead through the chapel's side door, the one only staff used. Inside, the chapel was warm, lit with the soft golden hue of wall sconces and a few flickering altar candles. The congregation was modest in size that evening, 27 souls in total. The service began at 7:00 p.m. sharp, like always. Hymns were sung, scripture was read, and Elias gave a sermon on Psalm 13 about feeling forgotten and yet still trusting. It was something personal for him, though Diane, his wife, had stayed home that night with a migraine, leaving Elias and Leah to carry on their Sunday tradition alone. When the final "Amen" was whispered and the last parishioner had shaken his hand and exited into the darkness, Elias lingered by the pulpit, Leah now curled on a pew bench, drowsy. "Let's head home, sweet girl," he murmured, placing a hand on her shoulder. She nodded, rubbing her eyes. That was the last anyone saw of them. The next morning, Marlow's sheriff, Carl Banning, received a frantic call from Diane Harper. Elias and Leah never came home. It wasn't like them, not even remotely. She'd called the chapel, the few parishioners she knew, even driven there herself just before dawn. Nothing. No sign of them, no movement. The sanctuary was unlocked. The lights had been turned off. But the Ford LTD was still there, parked in the same rear spot. Doors shut. Locked. The keys were gone. Inside the car sat Elias's coat, folded neatly on the driver's seat. His worn leather Bible was resting on the dashboard. Leah's rabbit keychain dangled from the glove box handle. No glass was broken, no tire tracks led away. No one had reported any screams, fights, or suspicious activity. Just nothing. Sheriff Banning brought in 2 deputies and a canine unit by noon. The chapel grounds were searched inch by inch, the wooded border combed. The church office was undisturbed. The candles Leah had wanted to light were untouched. The sacristy key was in its drawer. The entire chapel, including the old basement used mostly for storage, showed no signs of struggle. It was as if Elias and Leah had walked into thin air. News traveled fast in a town like Marlow. By Monday afternoon, people stopped their cars just to stare at the chapel. Church ladies whispered theories at the local diner. Some thought Elias had run off with his daughter for unknown reasons. Others feared the work of a drifter, a man seen passing through on Friday. None of it made sense. By the end of the week, state investigators had taken over. Elias's sermons were reviewed. His finances were scoured. No large withdrawals. No suspicious communications. He had no enemies. No known mental illness. No reason to flee. Diane, devastated, sat at her dining table, flipping through family photo albums, her fingers pausing at every picture of Leah with her father. "He wouldn't leave me," she told Sheriff Banning quietly, over and over. "Wouldn't take her from me." The community held a vigil. Search efforts continued for weeks, but as the November rains returned, the trail froze. No ransom calls, no sightings. Not even a single usable fingerprint in or around the car. The rabbit keychain was tested for prints, but only Leah's were found. It would be almost a year before the state officially classified the case as missing with foul play, suspected. Diane never left Marlow. She stayed in the same house, kept Elias's coat hanging by the door, kept Leah's room untouched. Every Sunday evening, she lit the altar candles herself and prayed. In the years that followed, urban legends grew. Some kids in town swore they saw a little girl in a pink sweater walking alone through the cemetery behind the chapel. Others whispered about Elias's sermons, how he once claimed that evil can walk through even holy doors. The chapel eventually closed. New management tried to reopen it in 1989, but failed. Locals said it felt cursed. But Diane, she never believed in curses. She believed in something worse, that whoever took her husband and daughter was someone who knew them, someone who walked out that night and saw them last. 3 weeks had passed since Elias and Leah disappeared, and the Harper home had grown eerily silent. Diane still made 2 cups of coffee every morning and placed one on the kitchen counter where Elias used to sit, but the cup remained untouched, growing cold by 9 a.m. She spent her evenings sitting near Leah's bedroom door, staring at the nightlight flickering beneath it, like it still meant something. Fear investigators had slowed their visits, the search parties thinned, and the town's whispers began to shift tones, from sorrow to suspicion. Then one morning Sheriff Banning arrived not with sympathy, but with a warrant. Diane opened the door in her robe, her face drawn and pale. She didn't flinch when he explained they had questions. She simply stepped aside and let them in. In the living room, Detective Marlene Cobb spread out a thin manila folder on the coffee table. "Mrs. Harper, we've found inconsistencies in the church's financial records," she began. "We'd like to talk about some recent transactions involving the building fund." Diane blinked slowly, hanging her hands to her robe. "I don't handle the books," she said. Cobb nodded. "That's true, but your signature is on a requisition form dated October 20th. It authorized the transfer of $12,000, 0 cents, to a separate account, a week before your husband vanished." Diane's breath caught. "That's a mistake, Heath Elias. We argued how." Cobb exchanged a glance with the sheriff. "Argued how?" Diane hesitated, then spoke, her voice brittle. "We thought the money should go to repairs. I wanted to use part of it for the food pantry. Things have been tight. The board voted we disagreed." "Loudly?" Cobb asked. Diane's eyes narrowed. "You think I did something to him over church money?" Sheriff Banning raised a calming hand. "No one's accusing you, Diane. We just need clarity. He walked out of that church with our daughter and never came back," she said, tears threatening. "And you think it's because we fought over a few $1,000s?" Her voice cracked. "But suspicion doesn't need proof. It only needs oxygen." That day, news spread like brush fire. The preacher's wife under investigation. The board chair, a stoic man named Gerald Wexler, admitted to hearing raised voices in the pastor's office that Wednesday. It was personal, he'd said. Diane found herself a stranger in her own town. Eyes followed her in the grocery store. A woman at the post office asked, "Have you heard anything yet?" and then whispered to her friend as Diane walked away. And then came the phone call. It was a Thursday night. Diane was alone, sorting through laundry that no longer mattered, folding clothes that belonged to people who might not return. The landline rang, 3 shrill tones that echoed too loudly. She answered, distracted. "Hello?" A pause. Then a woman's voice, quiet but urgent. "The little girl is still alive." Diane froze. "Who is this?" she whispered. The voice didn't answer, only silence. And then the click of a receiver. The line went dead. Diane stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind blank. When she came to, she called 911 and repeated exactly what she heard. The operator logged it. Investigators traced the call. It was from a payphone in a rural county nearly 60 miles north. By the time deputies arrived, the booth was empty. No witnesses, no fingerprints, nothing on surveillance, but something about the voice haunted Diane. Not what it said, but how it said it. Calm, certain, almost tender. Detective Cobb returned the next day. "Any idea who it might have been?" Diane shook her head. "But I believe her," she said. "That voice didn't lie." Cobb didn't agree either. She simply noted the statement and left. The lead, like so many others, turned cold. But in the days that followed, Diane's world continued to unravel. Letters arrived addressed to the widow Harper. Anonymous or typed. Some accusatory, "He left because of you." Others, cryptic, "Check the stone behind the pulpit." She gave them all to the sheriff's office. Most were dismissed as cruelty, the byproduct of public tragedy. But Diane began to keep them in a box beside her bed anyway. Proof, she told herself, evidence of something. She began to write her own notes back, never mailed, just folded and stored. To Elias, to Leah, to whoever made the call. Her handwriting, once neat and controlled, grew messy, slanted, ashy, rushed. The kind of script that belonged to someone begging the world to make sense again. The church board suspended services indefinitely. Without a pastor and with half the town now suspicious of his wife, St. John's doors stayed closed. Weeds sprouted through the cracks in the pavement. Children dared each other to peek through the chapel windows. Diane drove past every Sunday but never stopped, not anymore. Then one evening in late December, as snow dusted the town and the sky dimmed to iron, she sat on her porch wrapped in a blanket and heard the phone ring again. This time she didn't move. She let it ring 6 times, 7, 8. She stared into the dusk, heart thudding. When it stopped, she exhaled, and then stood, slowly, walking back inside. Her hands trembled as she lifted the receiver and dialed the last incoming number, but it was blocked. Of course it was. Still, she held the phone to her ear and whispered, "If you can hear me, please, tell me where she is." The silence on the other end felt heavy, like it was listening. But no voice came. The 3rd month after Elias and Leah vanished came colder than expected for Oregon, and Diane had begun sleeping in the living room, unwilling to step back into their bedroom, which now felt too wide, too silent, too honest. Most nights she left the television on without sound and stared at the screen as light flickered across the walls. It was during one such night, as wind rattled the windows and the kettle whistled long after it boiled, that someone knocked at the front door. 3 slow knocks, spaced and deliberate. Diane stood carefully, tightening her shawl, and opened the door to find Mr. Vernon Capps, an 82-year-old church elder who hadn't spoken a word to her since the second vigil. He looked older now, his spine more curved, as if the weight of time had finally broken him. "I won't stay long," he said, voice gravelly, "but I need to confess something." Diane stepped aside without speaking, too stunned to protest. They sat opposite each other in the kitchen, the old man fidgeting with his cap. "I served with Elias longer than anyone," he began. "I saw him grow from youth pastor to full shepherd, but he had a past before you came along." Diane remained quiet. In 1968, Vernon said, he was just a seminarian, still living in Portland, met a girl during his outreach work, don't know her name. She was young, confused, pregnant. Diane felt her fingers numb as she gripped her cup. Vernon looked at her, voice softer. "They had a child, a boy. The girl left town, gave the boy to Elias for a while when he was maybe 5, just showed up at his apartment." He sighed. "I only saw the boy twice. One Sunday, Elias brought him to a service, called him Sam, sat quietly in the front pew. Next week, he was gone." "Gone where?" Diane whispered. "Never asked, and Elias never spoke of him again. But he changed after that." Vernon stood. "I should have told you long ago, but I didn't know it mattered until now." Then he left, his shoes silent on the porch snow. Diane sat frozen for nearly an hour before she moved. She replayed memories like puzzle pieces. Times Elias grew withdrawn without reason, long walks alone after services, phone calls he'd cut short. All of it took on a new shape. That night she opened Elias's desk for the first time since the investigation. The top drawer was neat, as expected. Old sermon notes, receipts, a pocket knife, a dried flower Leah had once picked for him. But taped to the underside of the drawer was an envelope, yellowed slightly, bearing no return address. The postmark read, October 20, 1983, 3 days before the disappearances. It was addressed to Elias in unfamiliar handwriting, thick strokes of black ink. Diane opened it slowly, unfolding the letter inside. It was short, only one sentence. "Don't stand at the pulpit this week. Remember the child you left behind." The handwriting was jagged, almost angry, like each letter was carved instead of written. Diane stared at the page, the words searing into her mind. She flipped it over. No signature, no sender, but something about the tone. It was personal, vindictive. She checked Elias's calendar. That Sunday had indeed been his rotation to preach. She'd never known he received a warning. Why hadn't he said anything? She took the letter to Detective Cobb the next morning. Cobb raised an eyebrow, but took it seriously. "This opens up a new direction," she admitted. "We'll need to revisit the possibility of someone from Elias's past." Diane asked, voice thin, "Do you think it's related to the phone call about Leah?" Cobb didn't answer directly. "It's possible," but Diane saw the doubt flicker behind her eyes. That afternoon, Cobb pulled church personnel records and combed through Elias's early postings, trying to find any reference to a child named Sam. Nothing came up. There was no documentation, no baptism records, no emergency contact logs. It was as if Sam had never existed. Diane, however, was sure. Vernon's eyes had not lied, and the letter, whoever sent it, could fabricate. She began going through old boxes in the attic. Elias had kept everything: sermon tapes, youth camp flyers, even receipts from family road trips. She unearthed a photo album marked 19691970 in faded ink. Flipping through it, she found photos of Elias in his early 20s, clean-shaven, awkward in polyester suits. One photo showed him holding a small boy, maybe 5 years old, wearing suspenders and a serious expression. Diane gasped. On the back, in Elias's handwriting, "Sam March 1970. Her heart pounded. The boy's eyes were dark, deep-set, not unlike Leah's. She took the photo straight to the sheriff's office. Banning confirmed the date and logged it, but admitted there wasn't much to go on. "We'll look into it," he said, but Diane knew what that meant. The case was too old, the trail too cold. That night, she placed the photo beside her bed. For the first time, the silence in the house felt like it was listening, not empty, but waiting. She started writing again. Not letters to Elias this time, but to Sam. "If you're still out there," she wrote, "I need you to know I forgive you. I don't know what happened. I don't even know if it was your hand behind this. But I need to understand. Leah deserves that. I deserve that." She mailed it without an address, only to return to sender. It was symbolic, she knew, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, might read it. 3 days later, another letter arrived. No stamp, just dropped through the mail slot. Same handwriting. This time it said, "You never asked what happened to the boy." 2 weeks after the second anonymous letter arrived, Diane returned to the sheriff's office with both notes in a plastic folder, her fingers trembling as she passed them to Detective Cobb. Cobb had already grown wary of coincidences and cryptic clues, but something about the handwriting matched: sharp angles, uneven pressure, and the way the letter always curved slightly upward, like a half-formed hook. Cobb sent them for forensic analysis, but neither envelope had prints, and the ink yielded no useful trace. Diane, meanwhile, began asking around town, quietly but purposefully, revisiting old members of the congregation, hoping someone remembered something, anything, strange from the day Elias and Leah disappeared. Most people shook their heads or muttered vague condolences, eager to move past the tragedy. But then one afternoon, while she was visiting the town library to leave flyers about the case, a small voice spoke behind her. "I saw Leah that night," the boy said. Diane turned around to see a freckled face framed by a knit beanie. His name was Peter Langston, 10 years old, the son of the local grocer. He hadn't even been born when Leah vanished, but what he told her came secondhand, from his older brother, Aaron, now 16. Diane called Cobb immediately. Aaron was brought into the station with his mother the next morning. He sat stiffly, arms crossed, unsure whether he was in trouble. "You don't have to be scared," Cobb assured him. "We just want to hear what you saw that night." Aaron hesitated, then spoke. "I was walking home from Scouts," he said. "It was about 8. I passed the church and saw Leah." "Are you sure it was her?" Cobb asked. "Positive," Aaron said. "She had this red sweater with little white flowers. I saw her wear it to school." Cobb nodded. "Was she alone?" Aaron shook his head. "There was a man with her, tall, limped a little. He had on this long, dark coat, looked like one of those trench things." Diane's breath caught. "Did she look scared?" she asked. Aaron paused. "No, not really, just quiet, like she was thinking." He put his hand on her back, like to guide her. Then they walked down the path behind the chapel. Cobb frowned. "Why don't you say anything before?" Aaron looked down. "I didn't think it mattered. Everyone said she disappeared from inside the church." Cobb scribbled a few notes. "Did you see his face?" "No," Aaron said. "It was getting dark." The lead jolted the investigation back to life. A man with a limp and a black coat, possibly known to Leah, given her calm demeanor. Cobb dispatched a team to canvass the path behind the chapel, a seldom-used trail that curved along the tree line and led toward the northern edge of town. It bordered a dense cluster of pines, behind which lay several abandoned properties, mostly cabins that had fallen into disuse since the mill shut down a decade earlier. One in particular stood out, a narrow two-story cottage with rotted shutters and ivy crawling up its west wall. Locals called it the Maples, though no one remembered why. It had been empty since at least 1979. A search warrant was obtained within hours. When officers pushed open the warped wooden door, a foul mustiness spilled out, thick with mold and decay. Flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper, collapsed furniture, and shattered glass underfoot. But what caught Cobb's attention wasn't the ruin, it was the unmistakable signs of recent habitation hidden behind it. In the corner of the main room, beneath a carpet of washed bonds despite a dented kettle, in the hallway, a child's blanket, faded pink, cartoon rabbits, faded from wash or age, lay half-crumpled near a pile of dried leaves. But the most chilling find was upstairs. In the smallest bedroom, behind a door that stuck in its frame, the officers discovered a box of toys. Old, dusty, mismatched wooden blocks, a plastic train missing its wheels, and a single doll's head. Cobb bent to examine them, heart pounding, but it was the shoe that stopped her breath. A small, left-foot Mary Jane, worn at the toes, the heel scraped. Inside, stitched faintly into the inner lining, were the letters L. Cobb called Diane in to confirm. She broke into sobs the moment she saw the shoe. It was Leah's, a pair Elias had bought her for Easter, monogrammed as a surprise. Crime scene techs processed every inch of the house, lifting fibers, gathering soil samples, and testing the bowl remnants. They found remnants of canned beans, dried cereal, and traces of milk powder. Someone had been feeding a child there sometime in the past. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA hits, nothing to indicate when the place was last used. A neighbor vaguely recalled hearing noises months earlier, but assumed it was animals. No one had reported break-ins, and yet the presence of Leah's shoe and the handmade blanket meant someone brought her there, perhaps kept her there, and if that man had a limp, could he have struggled to carry a child far from that location? Cobb expanded the search radius. Dogs were brought in, but heavy rains had likely erased any scent. Diane, meanwhile, began spending hours walking near the property, retracing every path. She wasn't allowed inside again, but she often stood at the gate, whispering Leah's name like a prayer. Reporters came and went, their coverage rekindled briefly, only to drift again when the trail once more went cold. The man in the black coat remained unidentified. No one in town matched the description. No known drifters had limps. No sex offenders in the area fit the profile. Theories abounded. Maybe it was a cult, a madman, a runaway father come to reclaim a child. But nothing solid stuck. Cobb returned to the boy, to his letters. "You never asked what happened to the boy," the last one had said. The boy? Sam? Could he have returned? Limping, angry, resentful. Diane started going over old sermons again, this time listening not for scripture, but for subtext, tone, phrasing, emotion. One in particular stood out. Recorded just weeks before his disappearances, Elias spoke of guilt, of how the sins we hide will one day become the shadows that walk beside us. His voice cracked near the end. Leah had been in the front row that day, giggling softly. Diane remembered, but now the words felt different. He had been trying to tell her something, or someone. By the time 1988 rolled around, the once constant flow of sympathy cards, casseroles, and church visitations to Diane Harper had long dried up. The house grew quiet in a different way, no longer in mourning, but in surrender. Diane moved through her days like a ghost, dressing mechanically, sitting for hours in the same chair near the window, her eyes following nothing in particular. She had stopped lighting candles for Leah. She no longer wrote letters. The photo albums were packed away, and the last remaining toy of Leah's, a stuffed rabbit with one ear torn, was placed in a shoebox beneath her bed. She had exhausted every resource, every contact, every sliver of hope. The police updates had become formulaic. In February 1990, she was found in her backyard in her nightgown, kneeling in the snow, murmuring Leah's name over and over. Her neighbor called 911, and that night, Diane Harper was admitted to the Marlow Regional Psychiatric Facility with a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and psychotic features. Doctors said the prolonged trauma, coupled with 5 years of unresolved grief, had led to a psychological break. She stayed in the ward for 72 days. Her release was conditional on continued medication and regular therapy, both of which she agreed to, not because she believed in them, but because she had nothing else left to believe in. Later that summer, the case of Elias and Leah Harper was officially declared inactive. Detective Cobb, now reassigned to a different district, signed the paperwork herself, her pen hesitating at the final line. The file was boxed, labeled Missing Persons, Harper Family Closed Insufficient Evidence, and shelved in a locked storage unit at the county records office. No press release was issued, no vigil was held. It simply ended with a thud of bureaucracy. Diane, upon hearing the news, didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply nodded once and returned to her tea. Whatever fire she once carried had long since smoldered into ash. But not everyone had forgotten. In the fall of that same year, a man named Julio Ortega, former groundskeeper at St. John's Chapel, walked into the sheriff's office with a folded envelope and a strained conscience. Julio had worked at the church during the early 80s, cutting grass, fixing broken pews, occasionally filling in for the janitor. After leaving in late 1984, he had kept quiet about something he had seen, uncertain if it mattered or if it would even be believed. But with the case officially closed and guilt mounting after years of silence, he chose to speak. "I saw Pastor Elias meeting a woman," Julio said. "It was late, maybe 9 or 10 at night. It happened more than once." Cobb called back for the interview, asked what he remembered. "She was Mexican," he said. "Long black hair, always wearing the same blue shawl. They'd stand behind the chapel near the old tool shed. They never hugged, never touched, but they talked, intense, like old friends who had unfinished business." "Did you hear anything?" Cobb asked. Julia shook his head. "Never words, just tone. She was always calm. He sounded, I don't know, afraid maybe." Cobb asked for dates. Julia could recall at least 4 occasions, all within 2 months before the disappearance. On the last night he saw them, Elias had walked away from her, stopped halfway across the lawn, and stood still for nearly 5 minutes before going back inside the church alone. Cobb reappointed the case file briefly for internal review. A search for any visitors matching Julio's description yielded nothing. No one in town knew of such a woman, and no congregation records listed a visitor by that description. When shown a selection of archived photos, Julio pointed to one with hesitation, an old church group photo from 1974. A woman stood partially obscured in the back row, eyes dark and unreadable. "That's her," he said. "She was younger but the same face, but her name was not recorded." Cobb had the image enhanced and sent it to neighboring parishes and immigration records. Again, no matches. Diane, when told of this new thread, reacted with stunned silence. A woman? At the church? Elias had never spoken of another. Diane recalled no unusual behavior beyond his increasing fatigue, which she had always chalked up to the burden of ministry. But now, the timeline began to blur and crack again. The letter, the limp man, the shoe, the anonymous notes, and now this woman. A theory formed quietly in Cobb's mind. What if the woman wasn't a stranger, but someone from Elias's earlier life, perhaps connected to the child he never spoke of? Could she have been Sam's mother? Had she returned after years of silence, driven by guilt or grief or vengeance? And if so, what did she want from Elias? Or from Leah? Cobb returned to the chapel grounds, walking the now weedy paths Julia had once maintained. She paused at the tool shed where the meetings allegedly took place. It was locked with a rusted chain. She broke it open. Inside were cobwebs, a few rusted tools, and a tattered Bible with a torn front cover. On the inside flap, scrawled in red ink, "To E.H." She still remembers. It was unsigned, but it was dated October 14, 1983, 11 days before the Harper family. She photographed the message and brought it to Diane. Diane held the Bible in her lap, running her fingers over the faint script. "He never mentioned her," she whispered. "But I always felt something was chasing him. I thought it was shame. Now I wonder if it was someone." Cobb nodded. "This isn't over, Diane, not yet." But neither of them could explain how every lead, every clue, always stopped just short of real resolution, as if someone were pulling strings just out of reach. By the winter of 2010, Diane Harper had grown used to silence. The voices that once haunted her had dulled into whispers, and her movements through the world were small, measured, and mostly invisible. The town had changed without her. New families had moved in, the chapel had been converted into a community center, and children no longer whispered stories about the girl who vanished. Diane had stopped asking questions years ago, but the ache never faded. At 63, her days were quiet routines: coffee at 6, gardening by 8, and reading until her eyes blurred. That Christmas, her niece bought her a laptop, a modest silver device she barely understood. "You love it," the girl had said. "You can see the world without leaving the porch." Diane scoffed at first, but in the boredom of January she gave in. Slowly she learned to navigate. Email, news sites. Then, one afternoon, while exploring a map application, she discovered something called Street View. She began dropping the yellow figure onto random roads, peering into unfamiliar places. It felt like walking without moving, a silent, surreal kind of freedom. On a cold Tuesday, she dropped the figure near the Nevada border, close to a stretch of desert highway she remembered hearing about in a podcast. As the screen loaded, she found herself staring at a dusty roadside in a town called Galder Ridge, just 2 blocks of scattered buildings and rusted signage. But then her breath caught. On the right-hand side of the screen, paused in the lens of a passing map car, was a woman in her 20s crossing a dirt lot. She held the hand of a child, maybe 5 years old. The girl's hair was auburn, her build slight, her head turned slightly toward the camera as if sensing it. But what struck Diane hardest wasn't the face. It was the sweater. The girl wore a red knitted coat, worn but clean, and around the collar was a ring of delicate white stitching, an imperfect floral loop, slightly tilted. Diane's heart stopped. She had made that pattern herself 27 years ago. It wasn't store-bought. It wasn't replicated. That sweater had belonged to Leah. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the screenshot function. She took a photo of the screen with her phone, then copied the map link onto a document, printing it out twice in case one went missing. She stared at the paper for over an hour, then called Detective Cobb, whose voice had grown older but no less firm. "I need you to come see something," Diane said, barely above a whisper. Cobb arrived the next morning, and Diane showed her the image. "Do it? It's the sweater," Diane said. "Look at the collar. I stitched that by hand. No one else has that pattern." Cobb zoomed in on the screen, enlarging the image pixel by pixel. The woman beside the child was unfamiliar. Olive-skinned, dark hair in a braid, a small fearful juice, no jewelry. Her expression neutral. The child clung to her hand, but did not look fearful. Cobb nodded slowly. "You're sure it's the same sweater?" "I'd bet my life," Diane said. Cobb contacted the satellite service, submitting a request for the raw capture data and precise timestamp. Within 3 days, they received confirmation. The photo had been taken 4 months earlier during a regional mapping update. The GPS tag pointed to a location less than 2 miles outside Galder Ridge, a near-abandoned town known mostly for seasonal farm work and transient populations. Cobb contacted local authorities, but with no clear crime and no exact identity, they were limited in what they could do. Still, Cobb agreed to drive down with Diane just to see. It was a 12-hour journey split over 2 days. Diane, despite her age, insisted on coming. "If she's there," she said, "I want to be the one to recognize her." They arrived in Galder Bridge at dusk, where the air smelled of dogs and engine oil, and the streets bore more dogs than people. Cobb showed the photo to the only shopkeeper still open. He squinted. "Yeah, I seen 'em. Woman and a little girl. Come through once a month, buy oats and canned beans. Quiet pair. Ain't seen 'em in weeks, though." They canvassed the area, visiting diners, gas stations, and the single-room schoolhouse. One woman remembered the child, said she wore the same red coat every visit, even in summer. Another said the woman spoke very little, maybe Spanish, but she wasn't sure. The trail went cold quickly, but Diane remained by the window of the motel room that night, staring at the printout. "That's her," she murmured. "That's my Leah." Cobb wanted to believe her, but she needed more. She filed a formal request for utility records in the area and contacted neighboring towns for any mention of a mother and daughter matching the description, but with no names, no license plates, no formal complaint, there was little legal action available. Diane didn't care. "I'll wait," she said. "I've waited 27 years. What's a few more days?" Back home, Diane printed the image onto canvas and hung it above her fireplace, not as evidence, but as something closer to resurrection. Every morning she stared at it, tracing the outline of the girl's hand in hers, the curve of the sweater's thread, the tension in the woman's arm. She didn't know who that woman was, but she knew the girl. She had made that sweater during a rainy winter, using yarn that Leah had picked herself. No one could duplicate that mistake in the left loop, no algorithm, no coincidence. After returning from Galder Ridge, Diane refused to let the trail fade like the others before. Cobb filed a detailed report of the photo and their local inquiries, forwarding it to the FBI with a formal request to reopen the Harper file under new potential leads. While awaiting a response, Cobb reached out to the mapping service and requested the exact GPS coordinates of the image. A week later, a technician sent her a map marked with precision. The woman and the child had been captured walking near the base of Walker Ridge, a mountainous area on the border of California and Nevada, sparsely populated and mostly used for livestock grazing. Cobb had driven past it on their trip, never imagining that, hidden in those dusty roads and wide valleys, might be a piece of the Harper mystery. What drew her attention even more was that the region had barely been searched during the original investigation. Back in 1983, the focus had remained near Marlow, with efforts rarely expanding past the Oregon border. Walker Ridge had fallen through the cracks, just one of many places left untouched by limited resources and time. Cobb dug into local records and found a few property listings around the ridge, most of them dating back decades. One in particular stood out, an old farmstead registered to a Victor Salgado, a name with no digital footprint, no credit records, and no tax filings since 1995. The land remained technically owned, though all reports indicated it had been abandoned. Cobb flagged it immediately and requested aerial imagery from state survey records. What came back wasn't proof, but it was enough. A faded truck, a small fenced yard, and a visible line of laundry with child clothing flapping in the breeze. Diane, upon seeing the images, pressed her hands to her chest. "She's there," she said. "I know she's there." Cobb couldn't proceed without jurisdictional clearance, so she contacted the Walker County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Geegan, a seasoned man with a strong jaw and a deliberate tone, agreed to assist with discretion. "This area's hard country," he warned. "People out here live quiet for a reason." He sent 2 deputies to canvass the area, starting with residents who'd been in the valley the longest. On their second visit, they met Martha and Wayne Callister, an elderly couple who'd lived on the ridge for nearly 30 years. They maintained a small goat farm and kept to themselves, but when shown the photograph of the child in the red sweater, Martha's eyes widened. "I've seen her," she said, "at the general store in Thistle Grove. Comes once a month with a man. Keeps his head down, but he's got this scar, big one, runs from his left eye down to the chin." Wayne nodded. "Drives an old Dodge pickup, rusty thing, always pays cash, doesn't speak much, but the girl, she's polite, quiet, doesn't look scared, but she's always holding his hand like she's not allowed to let go." Cobb leaned in. "Did he ever give a name?" "No," Martha said, "but the store clerk calls him Red on account of his hair. Says he smells like smoke." Cobb made note of the pattern. A man with a scar, red hair, protective behavior. Theories spun fast in her mind. Was this man a captor or protector? Was he the one from Aaron Langston's story, the one Leah had walked away with 27 years ago? The Kellisters also mentioned something else. On nights with no moon, they'd hear a strange humming, low and mechanical, coming from the north side of the ridge. "Like a generator," Wayne said. "But no one's supposed to be living out there." Cobb cross-referenced the description with property records again. Victor Salgado's parcel was directly aligned with the direction of the sound. The deputies filed a formal visit to the land, but found the gate locked and no one present. No smoke, no lights, just silence. They didn't enter without cause, but Cobb wasn't ready to walk away again. Back in Oregon, Diane met with a former FBI liaison who had taken interest in the reopened file. He reviewed the satellite images, the local testimonies, and the timeline. "This might be nothing," he warned, "but it also might be your first real lead in decades." Diane nodded, her voice steady. "I just want to see her, even if it's the last thing I do." Cobb gathered the statements, photos, and the Callisters' report into a single file. She drove to Nevada herself this time, meeting Sheriff Geegan and requesting joint surveillance on the Salgado property. A drone flyover was arranged, but tree coverage and an aging barn structure blocked much of the view. A thermal scan indicated at least 2 warm bodies moving in the central house. Cobb requested a warrant, though Egan cautioned that unless there was evidence of abuse or immediate threat, entering could be a legal risk. Cobb replied, "The girl's been missing for 27 years. I'd say that qualifies." Meanwhile, Diane waited in a motel on the outskirts of Walker Ridge, staring each day at the same printout. The red sweater, the narrow hand, the woman's back turned slightly away from the lens. At night, she dreamed of Leah not as a child, but as she might be now, 34, perhaps with her mother's hands and Elias's eyes. Sometimes she imagined Leah angry, sometimes afraid, but mostly she imagined her waiting. Quiet, confused, alive. On the second morning of surveillance, Cobb received the official court order. A judge in Carson City had reviewed the evidence, photographs, satellite imagery, witness statements, thermal scans, and granted access to the Salgado property for law enforcement. Sheriff Jakin assembled a small tactical team, citing the remoteness and potential risk. Cobb rode in the lead SUV, her mind churning with every mile as the vehicles wound up the rough, narrow trail toward the secluded cabin. At 6:12 a.m., just as the sun began to break over the horizon, they reached the final bend. The property appeared quiet, no smoke, no lights, but a dog barked from within. The signal was given. Officers surrounded the structure and knocked 3 times, announcing their presence. When no response came, they breached the front door. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old cloth. The cabin was rustic but lived in. In the main room stood a woman in a flannel robe, frozen mid-step. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes wide. She looked around 30, though the shadows under her eyes hinted at a hard life. Behind her emerged a tall, limping man with a faded baseball cap and a scar along his jawline, exactly as described by the Callisters. He raised his hands calmly. "Her name is Layla," he said. "She's not in trouble. Please don't scare her." They secured the property and began questioning. The woman gave her name, Layla Hart. No identification, no birth certificate, no social security record. She claimed she had been living there for over a decade with Thomas Creed, the man who raised her. Cobb asked about her childhood. Layla hesitated. "I don't remember much," she said softly. "Just a church, a lot of white, a man with sad eyes." Then nothing. Cobb showed her the red sweater, retrieved from evidence and carried all this way. Layla stared at it for a long moment, then reached out. Her fingers trembled. "I had one like this," she whispered. "My mom made it. The stitching was crooked here, see?" She pointed to the left loop. Diane, waiting in a nearby cruiser, wept silently as Cobb relayed the moment by radio. Thomas Creed was taken into custody for questioning. In the sheriff's office, he sat calmly, hands clasped. He looked older than 50, but carried the demeanor of someone who had seen worse than handcuffs. "I didn't kidnap her," he said. "I was given the girl." Cobb raised an eyebrow. "By who?" "A man," Creed replied. "Came to me at the old gas station I used to work at outside Carson City. This was 18 years ago. He said he was being followed, said he was afraid, that someone would kill him if he didn't disappear. He had the girl with him. She was scared, quiet. He begged me to take her. Said she needed a clean start." "What did he look like?" Cobb asked. Creed shook his head. "He wore a hat low over his eyes. Kept calling her Leah, but told me to change her name. Said she'd remember too much otherwise." Cobb leaned forward. "Why didn't you call the police?" Creed sighed. "Because I'd just gotten out of prison. Petty stuff. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and she needed someone. I raised her right. I swear to God I never touched her. I gave her school books, taught her how to grow vegetables, how to read maps. I never kept her locked in." Cobb nodded slowly. "But you never let her talk to anyone." "She didn't want to," he said. "Not for years." Leila, meanwhile, sat with a trauma specialist. She answered questions carefully. Her memories were patchy, flashes of a red-carpeted hallway, a soft song sung by a woman, the smell of incense. When shown childhood photos of Leah Harper, she stared long and hard. "That could be me," she said. Cobb ordered a DNA test immediately. Within 48 hours, the results came back. A match. 99.998%. Layla Hart was Leah Harper, the missing child, now 28, alive, unaware of her name, her history, or the grief that had rippled through a town for nearly 3 decades. Diane was brought to the hospital where Layla was undergoing observation. She entered the room with slow, trembling steps. Layla sat near the window, staring at birds nesting under the eaves. Diane spoke first. "Your name is Leah," she said, "and I've waited 27 years to see your face again." Layla turned slowly, her eyes scanning Diane's face as if it were a half-remembered dream. "I think I know you," she whispered. Diane sat beside her, tears falling freely. "You were 5. You loved apple slices and hated buttons. You used to hide in the pantry when it rained." Layla nodded, almost imperceptibly. "There was a song," she said. "You used to sing it at night." Diane took her hand. "I still do." Cobb returned to the station, piecing together Creed's timeline and cross-referencing old maps. The gas station he mentioned had burned down in 1994. The name Elias Harper never appeared in any associated documents. But what if it wasn't Elias who handed the girl over? What if it was someone else, someone with access to Leah and reason to protect her? Cobb stared at the caseboard, eyes narrowing at the photo of the unknown Mexican woman, the anonymous letters, and now the mysterious handoff. Too many gaps, too many shadows. In the sterile calm of the hospital room, Leah Harper, now Layla Hart by habit, sat across from a therapist with a notepad and warm eyes, her fingers curled tightly in her lap. Her voice was soft, nearly a whisper, but steady. "We never stayed long in one place. First it was the cabin, then sometimes we'd sleep in the truck for weeks. He said it wasn't safe to talk to strangers. He said people lied and only God told the truth." She blinked slowly. "There were no schools. He taught me at home, reading from a Bible mostly. I never learned math. Didn't know there were 50 states until I was 16. When asked about her early memories, Leah hesitated. "I remember colors," she said. "Red yarn. A hallway with a wooden floor. Someone brushing my hair. But no names, not even his, until I was older. He just told me to call him Thomas. Or brother, when he was upset." She paused, looking out the window. "He used to say we were chosen, that the world was full of sinners and we had to stay clean. He told me if I ever made noise, God would turn his face away. So I didn't. I was quiet." All the time, Cobb, listening through the observation room speakers, clenched her jaw. Every word Leah spoke chipped away at the years of silence that had blanketed the case. Diane, seated nearby, listened with tearful restraint, her hand pressed over her heart. After a few sessions, Leah agreed to speak directly with Cobb. "He never hurt me," she said. "Not like that. He was strict, sometimes mean, but he fed me. He made sure I had clothes. I think he believed he was doing the right thing." Cobb nodded, then asked gently, "Do you know why he took you?" Leah looked away. "He said someone gave me to him. A man, with shaking hands. Said he had to disappear. I don't remember that part." "I was too young." Cobb asked if Thomas ever mentioned her mother. Leah shook her head. "Only that she was gone, that I didn't need to remember her because memories were like thorns, painful and dangerous." That night, Cobb returned to her hotel room and reopened the Elias Harper file, combing through everything with new eyes. The name Creed had appeared only once before, buried in a financial report from the church's early years. A donation from Margaret Creed had been recorded in 1971. Curious, Cobb ran the name through orphanage archives and juvenile records. What came back changed everything. Thomas Creed, born Samuel Elias Creed, 1968. Mother deceased shortly after birth, no father listed. Placed in state care by age 2. Transferred between 5 foster homes, eventually committed to a boys' institution for behavioral issues. Discharged at age 16. No contact with known relatives. No adoption ever completed. Cobb printed out the profile and sat in stunned silence. Sam. The name Vernon Capps had mentioned all those years ago. Elias's son, the child he had never publicly acknowledged. The one who disappeared. Cobb visited Thomas the next morning. He sat quietly in the interview room, hands clasped in front of him. Cobb placed the report on the table. "Your name isn't really Thomas, is it?" she asked. He said nothing. "You're Samuel Elias Creed, born 1968. Your mother's name was Margaret. She donated to the church once. You were 5 when you first met Elias. He took you to the chapel. Then he left you." Thomas, Sam, looked up slowly. His eyes were hollow. He said I was too much. Said I had darkness in me. But it was his darkness. Cobb leaned in. "Why Leah? Why take her?" His voice cracked. "Because she had his smile. And because he was going to throw her away, too. I couldn't let him do it again." He stared at the wall. "I waited outside the church that night. I saw him arguing with someone. I don't know who. We looked afraid. Then he went inside. I waited. When the girl came out, I followed her. I didn't mean to take her at first. I just wanted to see what he loved. But she saw me. She didn't scream. She just stared. And I thought, maybe I could fix what he broke." Cobb asked about Elias. "Did you hurt him?" Sam shook his head. "No, he ran. He disappeared, just like he always did. I never saw him again. Maybe he died out there. Or maybe he just found someone else to forget." Back at the hospital, Diane sat beside Leah, brushing her hair slowly. "You were never forgotten," she whispered. Leah leaned into the touch. "I didn't know anyone was looking." Diane smiled through tears. "I never stopped." Cobb returned to her office with the taped confession and placed it in the evidence locker. She stared at the folder marked Harper and finally allowed herself to write 3 new words in red pen across the front. Found, alive, remembered. The final confession came not from pressure or threats, but from the silence that filled Thomas Creed's cell each night. For weeks he had refused further questioning, but the weight of years and perhaps the growing realization that Leah was no longer his to protect finally broke him. He called for Cobb one early morning and asked only one question. "Do they still pray for him?" Cobb sat across the table, unsure what he meant. "For Elias," Thomas clarified. "Do they still pray for him in that church?" Cobb folded her arms. "There's no church anymore. It's a youth center now. Hasn't been a place of prayer in 20 years. He nodded, slow, absorbing the change. "Then it doesn't matter anymore." Thomas began to speak with deliberate calm, his eyes never leaving the floor. "That night," he said, "he knew I was there. He saw me. I had been watching him for weeks. I waited behind the shed after the service. I didn't come to hurt him, not at first. I just wanted him to see me, to say my name for once. He did. He said Samuel, but he also said it was too late, that his life had changed, that Leah needed him now, that she was what Matt Thomas's jaw tightened. He told me I was a mistake, a memory he had to survive. He said I had my mother's anger. He turned away, and I followed, into the trees. He tripped near the clearing, hit a stone, and Thomas stopped, inhaled shakily. I didn't plan to, but it happened fast. One hit, then another. He didn't move. I panicked, dragged him. There was an old well, dry, covered in leaves. I pushed him in, covered it with branches. I never went back. Cobb took notes in silence. The location matched a section of the woods that had been marked on early maps, but later written off as inaccessible during the initial search. With this new information, a team was assembled. That afternoon, they arrived at the site Thomas described. thick underbrush, a canopy of trees, and a partially collapsed stone ring. As they removed the overgrowth, the air turned damp and earthy. They lowered a light into the darkness. Bones, tattered fabric, a tarnished ring. Dental records confirmed what they already knew. It was Elias Harper. The discovery sent ripples through the town. News outlets ran headlines about the body found after 27 years, a preacher's final resting place hidden by the very man who called him father. Diane stood at the edge of the excavation site, clutching a scarf to her chest, her face unreadable. She said nothing for hours. When Cobb approached, Diane whispered, "I always thought he ran, that he couldn't handle it, but now I know he tried. He died protecting her, didn't he?" Cobb nodded slowly. In a way, maybe he did, or maybe he was trying to atone. Back in Marlowe's, preparations were made to finally give Elias a burial. The town agreed to reopen the chapel for one night. A simple service was held, with candles lining the aisles, and Diane sat in the front row holding Leah's hand. Leah still struggled to remember specifics. Images came in flashes, sounds more than words, but when the hymns played, she hummed instinctively, her voice trembling but true. Diane smiled through tears. "You remember the music," she whispered. "Your father used to sing that one off key." Leah smiled faintly. "I think I remember him laughing." At home, Diane opened a box from the back of her closet. Inside was a folded red scarf, soft, hand-woven, with a small repair on one edge where a snag had once torn it. She held it out to Leah. "He wore this the day you left. I've kept it every year." Leah took the scarf slowly, holding it up to her cheek. "It smells like cedar," she said, "like that old hallway." Diane blinked in surprise. "Yes, that's the chest we kept by the door." Leah closed her eyes. "I used to hide behind it when it thundered." Her voice was quiet, but full of something deeper. Recognition, connection, the thread of memory stitched tight across decades. Leah did not move back immediately. She needed time to learn the world, to relearn her own history, and to rebuild trust. But she stayed in touch. She called every day, sometimes just to ask what she liked as a child, sometimes to ask what Elias was like when he first started preaching. Diane answered each question, savoring each one like a drop of rain in a long drought. He showed no emotion during sentencing, but in his cell he was often heard whispering hymns, some distorted, some remembered wrong. Cobb visited him once more, years later, and asked if he had any final words for Diane or Leah. He looked up, his face gaunt. In spring, Diane and Leah returned to the clearing where Elias had been found. A stone now stood there, engraved with simple words, "He gave what he had left." Leah placed the red scarf at the base and stood in silence. The wind stirred the trees. Diane took her hand. "You came back to me," she said. "Even if you don't remember everything, your heart did." Leah nodded. It always knew the way home. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true mystery narratives. Which part of Leah's journey shocked you the most, and where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts.